Alright, it was a little late arriving, but welcome to the endocrine system. It is not a great weekend to record as I ended up with a migraine, but we persevere. It's pretty much gone now, and so I can actually look at a backlit LED, or LCD, whatever, words. Alright, so since this is a non-majors course, we're going to start real basic. The endocrine system is all about hormones, and what is a hormone? Well, it's any chemical, right, as long as it satisfies several key properties. One, it has to travel via the bloodstream. So a hormone is a chemical that is released into the blood. Two, it has to bind to specific target cells, right? So it has target cells. It does not necessarily affect any and every cell in the organism. There are only target cells that it will affect. And it is specific to those cells. So those cells will have little receptors that can bind to that hormone. And when that hormone binds to its target cell, there is a response, right? The cell responds and changes cellular activity. So the cell responds to the chemical by changing some facet of cellular activity. Now, structures that make hormones are known as the endocrine glands. Alright, so something that makes, an endocrine gland makes and secretes hormones. Right here is a little chart of some of the things we'll be hitting up. This is to give you an idea of how complicated the endocrine system is. This is just a small portion of the endocrine system, and in turn we'll be only going through a small portion of this. So I'm just trying to give you an idea of how complicated the endocrine system is. And it's all about homeostasis, baby. So here's our roadmap of endocrine glands that we'll be examining. First up will be the hypothalamus and its pal, the pituitary. Then we'll talk about the thyroid, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the ovaries, and of course, can't talk about the ovaries without talking about them testes. So here we go with the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is a mass of neurons, right? So it's a neuronal mass, sort of inside the brain. It's a region in the brain. It's not so much an obvious structure. So it has what we call neurosecretory cells. In essence, neurons that secrete hormones. And pretty much all, well, not pretty much, but a staggering number of hypothalamic hormones act on our pal, the pituitary. So the hypothalamus is a controlling gland that will determine often what glands secrete what. The main gland it controls is the pituitary, and this is such an important system here that we often call it the Hypothalamic-Pituitary Axis. It is an incredibly important system of control, right? So the hypothalamus, for a large number of pituitary hormones, will control when and if it secretes something and stops secreting something. So some of the hormones that are involved in the hypothalamus are vasopressin. Vasopressin doesn't act on the pituitary. It acts on the kidney. And its response, right, its target organ structure is the kidney, and the response is absorption of water from the collecting ducts back into the blood. So it absorbs water from the collecting ducts of the nephron back into the blood. Another one is oxytocin, and its target is, well, actually lots of things, right? So oxytocin has a number of effects here. It has some sort of function to play in orgasms, right? It has a function in trust. Well, that's actually, because of the wonders of science, been brought into question. So there was an experiment run in which people would look at pictures and rate the trustworthiness of the people in the pictures, and then they'd huff some oxytocin and wait a minute or so and then re-rate the trust of the people in the pictures. And oxytocin seemed to increase people's rated trust. So there was this whole thing about oxytocin is the love hormone. Oxytocin is the trust hormone. But then in later, more controlled, well-regulated, well-designed experiments, that relationship became a lot more iffy, to the point where, let's not say oxytocin is the love or trust hormone. Anybody who's saying that is operating off of old science. But oxytocin does play a role in body temperature, sleep cycles, breast milk production. There's lots of things oxytocin will act on and affect. It has numerous targets and numerous different responses. Sort of a fancy hormone. There's a lot of research in oxytocin because it's just so interesting. All right, here we go. The hypothalamus directly controls pituitary hormone release. So, how it does this is by secreting releasing hormones. There's a number of hormones that act as releasing hormones, and what a releasing hormone does is it tells the pituitary to secrete. So if the pituitary receives a particular specific releasing hormone, the pituitary will start secreting the hormone associated with that RH. So its target is the pituitary, and the response is to release hormones specific to that releasing hormone. And then there are a number of different kinds of inhibitory hormones. And they target the pituitary, and the response is to cease your release. Which is pretty cool. Coffee, very important. So, what's fascinating is a number of inhibitory hormones are the ultimate product of pituitary hormone action. We'll talk about that when we talk about the thyroid, which is kind of cool. Anyway, on to the pituitary. So, always remember, for almost all of the pituitary hormones, whether they're released or whether releasing is stopped is controlled by hypothalamic releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones. Some of the pituitary hormones we'll be talking about include growth hormone, GH, prolactin. What does that lact tell you about it, right? We are saying something with this prefix here. Yeah, lactation. So prolactin is involved in lactation. Right? Thyroid stimulating hormone. Right? Adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is, if you couldn't tell from the, first 6 letters there, this is acting on the adrenal glands. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Okay, so quick note, the releasing hormone. Whoa, go back, sir. Need my pen, jerk. The releasing hormone for growth hormone is literally GHRH. Isn't that nice? Right? For thyroid stimulating hormone, our releasing hormone is thyrotropin. Got ahead of myself in my brain. Thyrotropin. So this is the releasing hormone for both thyroid stimulating hormone and, interestingly enough, prolactin. ACTH, the releasing hormone, is corticotropin. And for both FSH and LH, our releasing hormone is called gonadotropin. So, these are our releasing hormones for these particular pituitary hormones. So, take it and peek. Oftentimes, by the way, instead of an inhibitory hormone to stop the pituitary, there will just be the hypothalamus no longer releasing the releasing hormone, and without the RH, the pituitary don't release its particular hormone. So sometimes just shutting off RH release from the hypothalamus is enough. And so the releasing hormone, the pituitary gland is kind of cool. It's sort of like a little bitty extension here hanging off of the hypothalamus. So it is below the hypothalamus, right? It's connected up to blood vessels because, hormones have to travel through the blood. In a lot of pictures, it kind of looks like, a pair of balls, which, I don't know, kind of is fun, right? It's a really important testicular resemblance of the pituitary. I don't know. Okay, so there we go. Your brain balls are really important in actions on the kidney, right? The breast tissue, the ovaries, the testes, the thyroid. There's hormones that directly affect the skin, bone, and muscle, and of course the adrenals. There's a lot of stuff going on here. And this isn't anatomy, so we won't really make a big thing out of the fact that there's the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary, and they secrete different things. But kind of cool. The pituitary is a complicated thing. So we'll start off with growth hormone, right? You'll never guess what growth hormone does. Well, it targets muscles, bones, my favorite category, other. What's its response? Yeah, growth. That's its response. So since this wouldn't be complete without talking about what happens when everything goes terribly, terribly wrong, if you have too little growth hormone, terribly, terribly wrong is sort of like not the greatest way to phrase that. Anyway, when you have a imbalance of homeostasis and you have too little circulating growth hormone, the result is dwarfism. Now note, this is not a chondroplasic dwarfism. A chondroplasic dwarfism is different. Peter Dinklage, Tyrion, he has a chondroplasic dwarfism. When this sort of growth hormone dwarfism is very different. It's basically just not getting that much larger. You kind of look like a miniature adult. So think like Munchkins from The Wizard of Oz. On the other side of this, when you have too much growth hormone, you get a disorder called acromegaly, often sort of colloquially referred to as gigantism. So pituitary dwarfism is that deficiency in growth hormone secretion. Right? So the pituitary is not releasing enough growth hormone. Now the big things that will help you identify whether or not this is achondroplasia or pituitary dwarfism is that in pituitary dwarfism all the limbs are proportional. So in achondroplasic dwarfism, oftentimes the legs and arms are not proportional to the torso and head. So all the limbs are in proportion to the body, and basically you're just very short. Now, there are treatments for pituitary dwarfism. You don't see a lot of pituitary dwarfism out there anymore because we have synthetic growth hormone, and you can just shoot up a child that is going through pituitary or going through puberty and does not. A child who is going through puberty who has a deficiency in growth hormone can be given human growth hormone as a supplement, injections of human growth hormone, and they will undergo puberty as normal. So this is why pituitary dwarfism is so rare these days. All right, on the other side is good old acromegaly, gigantism. So in acromegaly, you secrete significantly more growth hormone. And more than that, you're secreting that growth hormone throughout your life. So you have accelerated bone growth. You start growing very early, and you end up continuing that growth hormone secretion throughout adulthood, right? So you get extremely tall during your younger years. So from childhood to the end of puberty, you get tall. Now, what's interesting is at the end of puberty, your growth plates fuse. Now, this is important. The growth plates are where your bone elongates, where bones get longer. So, when you are secreting all that growth hormone and puberty ends, your bones then, because they don't really grow any, like you're not growing taller anymore, your bones grow in thickness. So, post-puberty, the bones grow in thickness. So, someone has a larger, heavier appearance. If you are a Princess Bride fan, Fezzik, played by the wonderful Andre the Giant, is an example of someone who has acromegaly. Here he is standing over several extremely large professional wrestlers, making them look like little bitty teeny people. Right? So Andre the Giant, very cool guy. Everyone loved Andre the Giant, gentle giant dude. So here is a nice record. This image down here is a nice record of appearance. So by age 9, you're starting to see a lot of the onset of growth that you'd associate with puberty. By age 16, you're pretty much looking like an adult. Past puberty, you can see that there's a thickening of features, right? Your cheeks thicken up. You have a thickening of the bones of the cheeks. You have a thickening of the nose, of the jaw. A lot of your bones are increasing in thickness. By middle age, the thickening has started to become rather extreme, right? So, problems associated with acromegaly include arthritis, osteoarthritis. So, you have a lot of mass on those joints, and so they break down early. Another thing associated with acromegaly is cardiac failure. Now, basically, heart failure occurs in a lot of people with acromegaly because they have extremely enlarged hearts. They have to have extremely enlarged hearts in order to supply the blood to that much, much larger body. And extremely enlarged hearts are prone to cardiac failure. So, heavy appearance, large, thick bones, heavy jaw and forehead, large ears and nose, that sort of thing. So, here is a young fella with acromegaly, Robert Wadlow. Good old Robert Wadlow lived from 1918 to 1940. He was the tallest man alive at 8 feet 11 inches. Woo, that is a tall guy. This is a full-size car. These are average-sized American women. He was a towering giant of a man. He toured with the circus, and he died at age 22 due to heart failure. Okay, so ending that growth hormone section on a up note. Yay. Okay, let's talk about thyroid stimulating hormone. Remember, we have the hypothalamus releasing thyrotropin, right? And that hits the pituitary, and the pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone, which then acts on the old thyroid to release something called thyroxine. Thyroxine or thyroid hormone. So, the thyroid is in front of your trachea, so beneath the larynx. So if you feel for your voice box, right, somewhere around here is your thyroid. There are 2 lobes, kind of looks like a little pair of wings, so you can see it really nicely in this image here. Here's our 2-lobed thyroid, the left and the right thyroid. So, its whole thing is that it releases thyroid hormone, thyroxine. So thyroxine regulates your base metabolic rate. your base metabolic rate. This is things like rate of breathing, rate of ATP production, that sort of thing. Base metabolic rate. So, increasing thyroid hormone release increases the base metabolic rate. So, increase in thyroid hormone, increase in thyroxine leads to an increase in base metabolic rate. So as long as the thyroid is exposed to TSH, it will produce thyroxine. So as long as there's TSH, it produces thyroxine. So how does the body turn off thyroxine production? Well, this is kind of cool, right? Thyroxine is the inhibitor as well. Basically, there is a concentration of thyroxine at which point, when your blood concentration of thyroxine reaches a certain point, it acts on the hypothalamus and the pituitary and causes them both to stop releasing their hormone. The hypothalamus stops releasing the releasing hormone. The pituitary stops releasing the stimulating hormone. And when that stimulating hormone turns off, thyroxine release stops. And basically it stays that way until thyroxine levels get too low. And then thyrotropin gets turned on, which turns on TSH, which turns on thyroxine secretion. Whee! So thyroxine is the inhibitor of the RH and the TSH, both the releasing hormone, thyrotropin, and thyroid stimulating hormone. That's kind of cool, right? Self-regulating. I dig it. I dig it. Now, one of the most important things about thyroxine, about thyroid hormone, is that it needs iodine, folks. It requires iodine. An iodine deficiency is a thyroid hormone deficiency, right? An iodine deficiency is a thyroid hormone deficiency. The thyroid needs iodine to produce thyroid hormone, to produce thyroxine. So what happens when you have that deficiency, right, is an enlargement of the thyroid. This produces something called a goiter, right? So the goiter is an enlarged thyroid. Basically what's happening is that when you don't have enough iodine, right, it only affects this particular part. It only affects the thyroid being unable to release thyroxine. So, if we're not getting enough thyroxine, then the body's basic mechanism is to increase the releasing hormone, to increase the stimulating hormone, to stimulate the thyroid. And since the thyroid isn't producing enough thyroxine, it will then enlarge in order to increase thyroxine production. So you can have a goiter due to hypothyroidism, which is what we're talking about. So hypothyroid goiters. Basically, the goiter enlarges in order to reach normal thyroid hormone production. So what little since you're not getting enough iodine in your diet to support thyroid hormone production at its normal rates, your thyroid literally increases in size in order to maintain thyroid hormone levels. So this right here is our goiter. So there we go. It is big and enlarged in order to be able to produce normal concentrations of thyroid hormone. Pregnant women, part of the prenatal vitamins you take and the vitamin regimen you take when you are pregnant is just a ton of iodine. A ton of iodine. Right? This is because not only do you have to start regulate the new base metabolic rate, which is much higher because you're growing something, right? Growth of a fetus, fetal growth. So, fetal growth equals a massively increased base metabolic rate. And until that fetus has a functioning thyroid of its own, then the maternal thyroid also has to produce enough hormone. So you have to crank up your thyroid hormone to support the base metabolic rate for fetal growth, and you have to crank up the thyroid hormone in order to support the base metabolic rate of the fetus itself. So the requirements of iodine in a pregnant woman basically doubles. So in history, there's actually been a fair amount of the population that cannot get enough iodine, right? So an iodine deficiency during pregnancy, right, produces a various sorts of birth defects. So you get what was once referred to as cretinism. Cretinism was the term for a fetal hypothyroidism. So, fetal or congenital, really. Congenital hypothyroidism. That was the term for a deficiency of iodine during pregnancy. They called it cretinism. So if you ever call someone a cretin, you're actually kind of using an old-timey medical diagnosis as an insult. Now, what's neat here is you might have noticed that the salt you buy from the grocery store, as long as you're not being one of those fancy snooty folks like me and buying fancy salt, the salt you buy from the grocery store is iodized salt, right? So basically the U.S. government contacted the salt companies, Morton's being the big one, and requested that they start adding iodine to their salt, because literally everyone cooks with salt. It makes everything taste just a little better. So by iodizing salt, the U.S. government drastically, by supplementing the cost in order to have salt become iodized, the U.S. government caused a drastic reduction in congenital hypothyroidism. So, continuing forward. So, I actually mentioned this already. The iodine deficiency produces a goiter. During pregnancy, you have iodine for 2, congenital hypothyroidism. Wow, I have a duplicate slide here. Congratulations to me. By the way, a hypothyroid goiter is often referred to as a non-toxic goiter. And this is because the non-toxic goiter is secreting normal thyroid hormone levels. It's secreting normal thyroid hormone levels. So this is a big thing because goiter doesn't necessarily mean hypothyroidism. Because on the other side of hypothyroidism, we have hyperthyroidism. So hypothyroidism, because you have low levels of thyroid hormone, you have a low base metabolic rate, and people with hypothyroidism will see weight gain, lower blood pressure. They'll tend to not have as much energy as your average person, and if it's low enough, they may get a goiter. Wow, I need to edit some slides here, man. Okay, so overstimulation. Okay, blah. Here's where I wanted to get to, hyperthyroidism. So, weight gain is a sign. Low blood pressure is a sign. Lethargy is a symptom. Goiter is a sign. So, all right, hyperthyroidism. Again, we have overproduction of the thyroid. Right? So, overproduction of thyroid hormone. Now, this can cause something called the toxic goiter. So, whereas a goiter in hypothyroidism develops because you need a larger thyroid in order to make enough thyroid hormone, here the thyroid is making so much thyroid hormone that you have what's called a toxic goiter. Basically, a toxic goiter is secreting extremely high concentrations. So, we are secreting at extremely high thyroid concentration. So, this enlargement is in response to the amount of thyroid hormone being produced. This is dangerous because a toxic goiter is actually capable of causing sepsis if it gets bad enough. That's why it's called a toxic goiter. No, not great. Alright, so one of the basic things that is produced by hyperthyroidism is an increased basal metabolic rate. You have an increased basal metabolic rate. So you also have increased blood pressure. You have lower weights, so weight loss. You can have protruding eyes, which are kind of funky. Exothalamosis. Interestingly enough, you'll see heat intolerance. Right? People will be able to, or be unable to tolerate heat as much as the average person. Hyperactivity, fatigue, and due to your general high production of thyroid and your hyperactivity, you'll see irritability. So, increased blood pressure, sign. Weight loss, sign. Exothalamosis, sign. Heat intolerance, symptom. Hyperactivity, symptom. Fatigue, symptom. Irritability, symptom. So, neat stuff going on. So, hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism are our disorders of the thyroid. And boom, continuing right along, we have adrenal corticotropin and the adrenals. So, first off, let's talk about the adrenals. They are little small endocrine glands, and they sit right on top of the kidneys. I like to call them little kidney hats. That's kind of what they look like, little kidney hats. And they are separated into two portions. The adrenal medulla, which is the inner portion. The inner portion, the adrenal medulla, synthesizes and secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. All right, so epinephrine and norepinephrine are associated with good old fight or flight or freeze. All right, the basic human animal, a lot of animals, right, have freeze as your most important response to a drastic increase in epinephrine and norepinephrine. And this is in order to gather sensory info. In other words, as an animal in the savannah, right, you might have lions with their camouflage hiding in the grasses, and you hear something, and you get a flush of epinephrine and norepinephrine, and you freeze, and you take in information from your ears and your eyes in order to locate the danger, because if you run without having any idea where it is, you might run into the lions. And if you fight without having any idea of what you're fighting, you might find yourself fighting a lion, right? So freeze is the most important part of the epinephrine-norepinephrine response. So this is largely involuntary responses to that hormone flush, which is fascinating. So, for instance, military, police, and firefighting training are often all about sort of reducing that freeze reaction, right? So, trying to eliminate freeze, or at least reduce it to a minimum for information gathering. And that's why it requires so much constant training, because without all that training, most people's reaction time is much slower, because obviously they're not extremely well trained under stressful situations, right? Stress basically amplifies the freeze response. Okay, so on the outer region of the adrenals, we have the adrenal cortex. Right, so this is the outer region. The adrenal cortex secretes cortisol, the stress hormone. So, cortisol is a hormone secreted in response to extended stress. Right, so under extended stress, like maybe low nutrient diets, maybe you're not getting enough food, you know, perhaps you are an early human and your berries failed during the winter and you're starving a little bit. A lot of the animals died, or there was a disease, right? So you are under extended stress and you start secreting cortisol. Because cortisol is all about energy, right? You want to conserve and store energy. So, cortisol is often associated with weight gain. So, if for extended periods, if you're under a large amount of stress, you will find yourself gaining weight, and you can largely thank cortisol for that. Another function of cortisol is to suppress the immune response and suppress inflammation. Right? This doesn't sound particularly logical, to suppress the immune response and to suppress inflammation. But honestly, when you suppress inflammation, for instance, if your extended stress is due to injury, inflammation around a joint reduces joint mobility. So if you suppress that inflammation, you may gain some mobility out of injured joints. Right? So, and in order to suppress inflammation, you suppress the immune system. So this is why someone under increased stress, even if there's no injury, their immune system gets decreased and they're more prone to sickness. But cortisol is a really fascinating hormone. And it does more than just this. But this is our non-majors review of cortisol. So moving on, we have the other hormone you've heard of before from our urinary system lecture, aldosterone. So aldosterone is all about reabsorbing sodium from the collecting ducts of the kidney back into the blood. So you pull sodium out of the nephrons back into the blood. And the reason you do this is, what was that? What do you need to do? Why would you need to reabsorb sodium? Under what conditions? When your blood pressure is too low and you need to increase the volume of the blood. You need to increase water volume of the blood because water follows sodium. Okay, on to follicle stimulating hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone has actions in both males and females, right? And it has different actions in both males and females. So one of the most basic things about follicle stimulating hormone is that it is required for fetal development. Whether it's a male or female fetus, if you have a deficiency of follicle stimulating hormone, that fetus will likely be spontaneously aborted. So required for fetal development. In males, we talk about this in more detail in the reproductive system lecture, what it does. But one of the most basic things it does is stimulate testosterone production. So in males, right, you have the pituitary releasing hormone which acts on the pituitary releases FSH and LH, and the hypothalamus is, in order to stimulate the pituitary to do this, is releasing gonadotropin. So the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin, and the pituitary responds by directly releasing follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So it is required for fetal development, and it stimulates testosterone production in males. So there we go. So FSH acts on the old testes in males and causes the testes to release testosterone. All right, so in females, the target is the ovaries. Ovarian? The ovarian system? I don't know. How about ovaries? Man, I need to do some editing here. Too late for that. Migraine prevented it. All right, so the response to follicle stimulating hormone is the development of the follicle and maturation of the egg. So the follicle is the structure containing the egg. So the follicle contains the egg. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates maturation of the follicle, and as the follicle matures, it matures an egg. So that's why it's follicle stimulating hormone. So, named primarily for its function in the female. So target is the testes in the male. The response is sperm maturation. So it has a direct effect on sperm. So not only does it stimulate testosterone production in both males and females, it has the response of sperm maturation in males. So if I made it sound like testosterone production is only stimulated by FSH in males, apologies, because both males and females require testosterone. So obviously FSH, by its very nature, stimulates testosterone production in males and females. It's just, in males, that happens in the testes, and in females, that happens in the adrenals. Alright, so luteinizing hormone. Alright, so again, in females, the target is the ovaries. And the response of luteinizing hormone is to trigger ovulation. So luteinizing hormones target cells are the ovarian cells. That's probably why I wrote ovarian. Anyway, the target is the ovarian cells of the ovaries, and the response is to trigger ovulation. So, in other words, what happens is the follicle ruptures, and the egg is released into the oviduct. Alright, so in males, the target is, drumroll please, the testicles. Right, and the response is testosterone synthesis. It's synergistic with FSH in its effects on testosterone. Okay, so there's our endocrine lecture brief thing on FSH and LH. Talk about FSH and LH more in the reproductive system lecture. Alright, the pancreas. So, again, we mentioned the pancreas in the digestive system lecture, right? And there we learned that the pancreas sits just below the stomach, right? And it has a little duct that empties into the duodenum of the small intestine, and it releases pancreatic juices. Delicious pancreatic juices that digest stuff. But that's digestive functions. This is the endocrine lecture. So none of those functions are worth mentioning, because our pancreas is not only just it is both a digestive organ and an endocrine organ. And they are separate. So we are talking about the pancreas as an endocrine organ, an endocrine gland right now. So, fascinatingly, the pancreas is not affected by the pituitary. The pituitary does not regulate the pancreas. So, rather, the pancreas is intimately involved with blood glucose. So the endocrine function of the pancreas is to regulate blood glucose concentrations. So So we have a pair of hormones synthesized and secreted by the pancreas. Number one is insulin, and number two is good old glucagon. And these two interact in order to control blood glucose concentrations via good old homeostasis. So, insulin, right? Insulin is secreted when blood glucose gets to low or high. Yes, thank you, me, for picking that one up. So it's secreted when blood glucose gets too high. And you all know that diabetics have to be careful about their diet and their sugar intake because they can spike their blood glucose. So insulin is all about decreasing blood glucose concentrations. It's secreted when blood glucose gets too high, and it reduces blood glucose concentrations. How does it do this? Well, it acts on both the liver and your body tissues. So the liver specifically takes up glucose into it and produces something called glycogen. So glycogen is just, if this dot is glucose, glycogen is just a complicated organic structure that has tons of glucose. It's a big chain of glucose useful for storage. Alright, so it's a big old chain of glucose. Storage. So if it's obviously stored in the liver as glycogen, it's not in the blood. Alright, so the body tissues take up glucose and make a bunch of ATP. So the net effect of having the body tissues take up glucose and making ATP, and having the liver taking up glucose and making glycogen, is to decrease blood glucose concentrations. And if blood glucose concentrations get too low, say maybe you've waited too long between meals, or you've got some kind of disorder, or high levels of activity have used more energy than your base levels, then you need to free up some of your stored glucose. So glucagon is secreted when the glucose levels get too low, and its primary target is the liver, right? And what it does is say, hey liver, I noticed you've got some chains of glucose as that tasty glycogen. Well, I could use that glucose, so why don't you break all that glycogen down and release it into the blood in order to increase blood glucose concentrations. So if we're going to talk about disorders of the pancreas, the endocrine system here, then our big one is diabetes mellitus, however you want to say that. Okay, so there are two types of diabetes. First is type 1 insulin-dependent diabetes. Right? So this is thought to be an autoimmune type of diabetes in which the body's own systems attack, the immune system attacks your insulin-producing cells. So you have these little pancreatic islets. That's a fun term there, the pancreatic islet is a collection of cells that synthesize and secrete insulin, right? And so in autoimmune type 1 diabetes, the immune system attacks the pancreatic islets and drastically reduces your ability to make insulin. So, since your ability to make insulin is decreased, naturally, your insulin levels are too low. So, this is the most common source of diabetes amongst children. This is if you're talking about childhood diabetes, more than likely it's type 1 diabetes. So, basically the treatment is good old-fashioned insulin shots. Right? We have genetically modified cells to produce insulin in the laboratory, and we just take that insulin and purify it and give it to diabetics so that they can inject it and actually, live. So that's good, I think. Right? Hooray for GMOs. Right, type 2 insulin is often called adult onset diabetes. And so, for reasons that are not quite fully understood, these pancreatic islets kind of just still function, and they're still cranking out insulin at like the kind of proper levels, but your cells in the liver and the body tissues kind of stop responding properly, right? So basically your insulin levels can kind of like, your insulin levels aren't too low, but your cells aren't really responding to the insulin. So your glucose is still high in the bloodstream. Right? So your liver isn't turning it into glycogen. Your muscles aren't breaking it down and making it into ATP. So the glucose is still in the bloodstream, and it can get too high. This is why when people have adult onset diabetes, the main treatment for that is diet. Diet. Because you can sort of like inject a bunch of extra insulin in order to get enough of a response to treat that. But if you can regulate your diet much better, drastically reduce your sugar intake to little, if none, well, you can't do that, but very, very little sugar intake, then you can regulate your blood glucose through diet. So that's the big treatment for adult onset diabetes, because your cells do not respond properly, and you are not taking up the glucose into the body tissues and turning it into glycogen in the liver, and so your blood glucose levels are too high. And when your blood glucose levels are too high, you can damage the capillaries. So a lot of places like your extremities, your fingers, your toes, can get a lot of capillary damage. You can end up with having to have limbs amputated, fingers and toes. My uncle Fred ended up having his big toe amputated because he wouldn't do anything about that. No, wait, that was Uncle Donald. Uncle Fred didn't have diabetes. Whatever, family history. Speaking of family history, there is a strong hereditary component to adult onset diabetes. If you have family members who have had adult onset diabetes, you are far more likely to have adult onset diabetes. Now, the other big thing that seems to contribute to adult onset diabetes is, for reasons that are not entirely well understood, diet and obesity. The bigger you are and the crappier your diet, the more sugar-rich your diet, the more likely you are to get adult onset diabetes. So, funky. So there we go. Another interesting type of diabetes that is not diabetes mellitus, or mellitus, I'm going to say mellitus because I think that's how I've heard it said, is gestational diabetes. So gestational diabetes is obviously associated with pregnancy. Amazing. Who could have thought? So gestational diabetes is associated with pregnancy. It is transient, meaning that you get it when you are pregnant, but, it is temporary. So during gestational diabetes, the needs of the placenta, basically the placenta needs glucose. So the placenta stimulates a buildup of glucose in the mother because lots of ATP are required for fetal development. In some people, that buildup of glucose for ATP production for fetal development reaches a point beyond pancreatic management, and you have increased glucose levels. So the placenta's requirements, the placenta stimulates an increase in glucose circulation. Your blood glucose goes up so that you feed enough glucose to the fetus so the fetus can develop. So the blood glucose circulation goes way up to feed the placenta, right? And if it goes high enough, it overwhelms the pancreas's ability to regulate that, and so you end up with high blood glucose, which is basically what you need for being called gestational diabetes. So again, this is temporary, the result of which primarily is very large babies. The infant is big and large and fat because it got tons of glucose. Right? The infant did what the human body does. Stores the excess as fat. So, much bigger infants. Okay, so the ovaries as endocrine glands. We have two main hormones to talk about the ovaries. It's estrogen and progesterone. So, the target of estrogen and progesterone are not only the gonads themselves, but also the skin, the muscles, the bones, right? So you get a lot of estrogen production during puberty, which is primarily responsible for estrogen and progesterone levels really start going to normal adult circulating levels during puberty, and this stimulates the development of secondary sexual characteristics in females. So the secondary sexual characteristics. Right? These are things like enlarged breasts. These are things like enlarged hips. Larger thighs. Right? So basic stuff like that. Those are the secondary sexual characteristics. The primary sexual characteristics being the presence of ovaries, oviducts, a uterus, a vagina, a vulva, that sort of thing. So, dropped my stylus. So in addition to the development of secondary sexual characteristics during puberty, you also have the onset of the female cycle, so the period. So the response of estrogen, the response to estrogen, that's that EST, not established, estrogen, is to grow the uterine lining during the female cycle. The uterine lining is what will eventually develop into a placenta should an embryo implant in that uterine lining. So during the cycle, starting just after menses, the period, estrogen stimulates increasing growth in that uterine lining. So if this is the uterine wall, this is the lining. And estrogen stimulates the growth of that lining. Right? Now, progesterone, its whole effect is to maintain the lining at the correct levels and thus also maintain the placenta. Right? So progesterone can be thought of as a pregnancy hormone. Its most drastic effects occur during pregnancy. So it maintains the uterine lining at its enlarged state, and it maintains the placenta. And if you're pregnant, it's important for that uterus to kind of expand just a little bit, So the progesterone has an effect on the uterine muscle to relax the crap out of it so that it can expand. In addition, it has a lot more stuff. My favorite category of functions, other. So, kind of funky. So what's neat is that progesterone is secreted by a broken follicle, a ruptured follicle. What are you doing, thing? The follicle is what is secreting progesterone. Specifically, which we'll talk about during the reproductive lecture, but you know how when I said that FSH stimulates the follicle to mature and the egg to mature, and luteinizing hormone stimulates rupturing of the follicle to release the egg? Well, so if this is your follicle here, and then it busts open and the egg is released. Hey, stop it. I'm just trying to draw an egg nucleus. What? I hate you. So, here's our little bitty egg. And then it ruptures and the egg is released. This ruptured follicle really? This ruptured follicle becomes what we call, it develops into what we call the corpus luteum. And it's the corpus luteum that is making this progesterone. So, when you look at the cycle, it's pretty cool. So if you look at estradiol, which is estrogen, all right, so where'd my thing go? Here's estradiol in blue. Over time, good Lord, it's hard to see my icon. So here's the beginning of the cycle, and our estradiol is increasing in production in order to increase the thickness of that uterine wall. Right? Progesterone level is basically kind of nil. So here we go. FSH is stimulating maturation of the follicle. Estrogen is increasing in concentration. and our uterine lining is growing until kablam, we hit here, and there's the release of luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is associated with this big spike in estradiol and the ovulation. When that egg is released, estradiol drops off. So estradiol has this big old decrease here as the egg is released, and that follicle, now that it's released an egg, is that corpus luteum, which is making our progesterone. And progesterone goes up. So there you go. Increasing progesterone, by the way, decreases estrogen, which is kind of cool. Progesterone inhibits estrogen. Okay, on to the old testes as an endocrine structure. We're getting real close to the end, my friends. Alright, so testosterone is the primary endocrine, the primary hormone secreted by the endocrine gland here. Testosterone targets, well, the gonads, but also the skin, the muscles, and the bones. Alright, so there's a spike of testosterone production during puberty, and it is responsible for the male secondary sexual characteristics. Right, so this is things like an enlarged larynx, right? You have increased muscle compared to the female, muscle and bone growth compared to the female, and you have maturation of the testicles as a sperm producing structure. Making them sperms. You have an enlargement of the penis. So, there we go. By the way, for the misinformed internet folks out there, giving yourself a big ol' injection of testosterone will not enlarge your penis. Testosterone enlarges the penis during puberty. After puberty, what you got is what you got, and there ain't nothing wrong with it. So, you know, look to your crotch if you're a male and give yourself a thumbs up, I guess. It seems to have some effect on sex drive in both men and women, though it is not well defined. It is another one of those things where there was an experiment that showed a very clear effect, and then further experiments showed a further more well-controlled, well-designed experiments showed a much, much lower effect. So it has some effect on sex drive in both males and females. So, and again, in my favorite category of hormone effects, there's more stuff. Okay, so obviously the endocrine system is all about hormonal homeostasis, right? So it's all about maintaining concentrations of hormones in the blood, right? Because hormones are in the blood, and you have to have specific hormone concentrations in the blood in order for the cells to respond to those hormones. That was a nice belch. Enjoy that in the lecture. So, you have to maintain hormone concentrations at specific levels at specific times, right? So, during puberty, growth hormone concentration homeostasis goes way up, right? But after puberty, growth hormone is homeostasis at a much, much lower level. Anyway, one of the primary negative feedback controls is, of course, releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones in the hypothalamic-pituitary axis. So your easiest one there is in your hypothalamus, right? Let's go for the easiest example. We have thyrotropin, right? And then thyrotropin acts on the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which acts on the thyroid to release thyroxine or thyroid hormone. So this is the pathway for increasing it. And then when thyroxine hormone reaches a certain concentration, it acts on both the hypothalamus and the pituitary to decrease TSH and thyrotropin levels, which is kind of cool. So this is a very simple homeostasis pathway for the hypothalamic-pituitary axis. And then our other very simple homeostasis pathway was the good old pancreas with its pancreatic hormones, insulin and glucagon, for those of you with just terrible memories. So, boom. Here's our nice, pretty picture of insulin and glucagon. But if I wanted you to draw it, right, if this is our ideal glucose concentration, right, I can't remember what it is. It's something like 100, I can't remember if it's milligrams or micrograms, but it's 100, let's go with milligrams. That seems like a lot. Micrograms? 100x per something like deciliter, I think, of blood. So, 100 grams per deciliter of blood. Whatever, that's not important. So, if blood glucose concentration starts getting high, like maybe you've had a delicious meal, we release, too high. We release insulin, which acts on the liver and the body tissues, like the muscle. So the body tissues take it up and crank out the ATPs, and the liver takes it up and cranks out the glycogen. And because it's doing that, insulin goes down. And then when it goes down too much and goes too low, right, we release glucagon. And that acts on the liver to cause glycogen breakdown. And when glycogen breakdown occurs, it releases all them little glucoses chained up, and they go into the blood, and we get back to our ideal homeostasis glucose level. So there we go. We got two separate models for endocrine homeostasis. We've got our hypothalamic-pituitary axis model, and we've got our pancreatic model, which is both pretty nice. There you go. And once more, a look at that big, gigantic graph, right? Or graph. Picture, our figure, right? So here we have the anterior pituitary, right? And it's releasing growth hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. Right? Then we have melanocyte stimulating hormone. We didn't mention that, but melanocyte stimulating hormone literally stimulates melanin production. It's released in response to ultraviolet exposure. And then there's prolactin. So all them pituitary hormones we mentioned. Then there's other pituitary hormones and other thyroid hormones. Parathyroid, we ignored the parathyroid. All sorts of stuff. Whoa! This connects to that, and there's this, and homeostasis, and lectures.